Hey guys, Alex Sutherland here, and you may know me from Card Runners as Asuth. And today I've got a really exciting video for you guys on minimally exploitative play and using it to measure the EV magnitude of leaks of non-GTO strategies. And I'm really excited about this. We're going to use some new software tools. We're going to look at some mathematical concepts that my guess is most of you guys have not seen before. And our goal is going to be able to look at a strategy that is not GTO, that we know is a deviation from GTO, and say, how can we actually measure in EV the exact magnitude of a very specific leak? How big a leak is it? How much EV do they lose? How do I actually generate the strategy that exploits it in a way that does not open me up to counter exploitation, or minimally opens me up to counter exploitation? And how can we use this at the tables to both attack opponents we see not playing GTO, to understand how you attack them and how much EV there is to gain by attacking them? So let's get into it. The goals of this video are to teach you guys the theory of minimally exploited play and how you can use it to do leak measurement. And then we're going to revisit the King 8-6 two-tone board from my flop Seedbed defense pack and actually use a new software tool I'm going to show you guys called Simple Postflop to measure the magnitude of the leak of a 1 - alpha based Seedbed defense. And for those of you guys who haven't watched my flop Seedbed defense video pack, it's at gtorangebuilder.com/GTO Dojo on the GTO Dojo page of my site. And basically what I did there was I used GTO Range Builder to compute about 15 GTO flop solutions for out of position play in single raised pots. And I looked at what optimal Seedbed defense looks like in those spots. And what we saw was that the often used 1 - alpha Seedbed defense frequency, which says that you use the alpha value from the mathematics of poker and calculate that, and you can't fold more than the 1 - alpha of your range, which for a 2/3 pot Seedbed equates to, determining that you need to defend at least 60% of the time. We looked and saw that GTO play did not defend nearly 60% of the time. It defended much closer to 50% of the time on most boards. And we tried to understand why that is, what the mathematical flaws in a 1 - alpha defense are, and why it doesn't actually work. But what we didn't really do, we measured a little bit how GTO play performs against a 1 - alpha defense. We didn't really measure how exactly exploitative play performs against it and how you can use minimally exploited play to directly attack this leak, generate a strategy that attacks it, and measure the EV magnitude of the leak. So that's what we're going to do today. So let's get into it. What is minimally exploited play? The basic idea is that we assume a very specific leak in our opponent's strategy, and we solve for GTO play assuming that our opponent cannot fix that leak. At any other part of the game tree that's unrelated to the specific leak, our opponent can do whatever he wants. He can play solidly. He can even try and compensate for the leak that he has. But the specific leak that is assumed is not something he can fix. We remove that from part of his decision-making process and make it a rule of the game. So if we want to take a simple example, let's imagine that our opponent is reacting to our flop C-bet defense, or reacting to our flop C-bets in a way that we've kind of looked at, measured with our, with him, and we think we understand. And we've noticed that this guy folds to C-bets 40% of the time, even though GTO play in the spot folds 50%. So that would be, against a 2/3 pot C-bet, that would be a 1 - alpha defense versus what, something like GTO Range Builder would show, which would often be closer to a 50% fold. And if we have this data in our HUD, the question is, how do we actually attack this player? And, what people have often thought of in the past was to try and think about maximally exploited play, which I will talk about the differences between maximally exploitive and minimally exploited play later. But I think maximally exploited play is A, not really actually calculable, B, very, very open to counter exploitation. It has a whole bunch of weaknesses. Minimally exploited play, the way you do it is you say, okay, I'm going to lock this guy's c-betting defense in. He's only when I c-bet him, he has to play the way that my HUD data says he does. But everywhere else in the game tree, I'm just going to, let him do whatever GTO play given that c-bet defense is. So the result of this is that we're taking his leak and kind of building it into the game, saying this is just fixed. But everywhere else we're solving for GTO. So this is a core distinction. We're basically directly attacking the specific leak and letting him do whatever he wants everywhere else. So if you guys are interested in a simple example, you can actually look at my rock, paper, scissors brain teaser from GTO Brain Teaser number 1 on my blog. I posted this about a year ago. In that game, the idea is that you're playing rock, paper, scissors against a player who has a specific leak. He plays rock half the time. But you don't know what he's going to do the other half of the time, and he may, compensate for playing rock when he's forced, according to his leak. And the question is, how do you actually play strategy that guarantees that you win money? Because this is a leak he has, you should be able to win money. And I'm not going to go through the solution in depth here. I'm not going to go actually solve it. If you go to my blog, blog.gtorangebuilder.com, and look for the first brain teaser from, I believe, April of last year, you can watch the solution. There's a full video solution on my YouTube channel. There's all sorts of stuff that will explain this in depth. But the key ideas I do want to highlight here are to really understand the differences between maximally exploitative play and minimally exploited play in a case like this. So maximally exploited play against, this strategy, it turns out you actually even can't really compute maximally exploited play. You need to know everything your opponent does to actually understand what maximally exploited play is. You can't compute it just based on a specific leak. And to understand that, let's take a simple example. He's playing rock half the time, so intuitively you might think the counter is paper. But if the other half of the time he plays scissors, then when we play paper, he will counter us by playing scissors half the time, and we'll actually break even against him, as though he had no leak. Because in rock, paper, scissors, generally you're always going to break even against your opponent. Now, if we knew exactly what he was going to do against us, it turns out that the counter to someone who plays rock half and scissor half is to play rock all the time, because we tie half and win half. But in the half of his strategy he's free to mess around with, he could play paper all the time, and then he's playing rock half, paper half, and we're playing all rock, and we actually are losing against this opponent who has a leak. So for this kind of targeted leak exploitation, where we don't actually know what our opponent's going to do when they're not playing according to their leak, and they might counter-exploit us, maximally exploited play has really nothing to say. You can't even calculate what it is because you don't have the full opponent strategy. What maximally exploited play is depends on what your opponent does across the entire game tree. You need to know every little detail of their strategy to compute it. And if we try and kind of guess things they might do in the rest of their strategy, usually we're going to guess things that are counter-exploitable. Remember, maximally exploited play can always be done as a pure strategy. There's no mixing. So the only maximally exploitive options, or maximally exploited play is covered by the options always play rock, always play scissors, always play paper. And we've examined 2 of those already, and always playing scissors is obviously going to lose because our opponent will just always play rock. So this problem really has no maximally exploitive solution, and maximally exploited play is super, super brittle. With minimally exploited play, it turns out that we can find a equilibrium strategy where the exploitative player plays 2/3 paper, 1/3 rock, and no matter what our opponent does with the rest of his strategy, we're guaranteed to win, a sixth of the pot in EV. So we're playing for $100. Each round we're going to win $16.66 in EV. So if you're curious about that, you can go check out the blog. But that's the kind of core idea I want to get across, is that you can't actually even compute maximally exploited play based on a specific leak. You need to know the entire opponent strategy. And if your opponent is free to kind of counter-exploit you in other spots of the game tree, you can end up losing trying to play maximally exploited against them, or you can end up breaking even, or you really don't know what's going to happen. It's not even well-defined to try and play maximally exploitively. I'll get into these details a little bit more and go through one more example to really clarify this distinction. on the next slide. Before I do that, I just want to go through two quick definitions, mostly because I brought them up in my flop Seedbed defense pack, and I want to make sure everyone's clear on distinctions here. So there's two types of minimally exploited play you can talk about. One is a downstream minimally exploit, and that would only alter our play further down the game tree than our opponent's leak. So again, taking this reaction to a c-bet as the leak, downstream exploited play would not alter our c-betting range because our opponent hasn't responded yet. It would only alter the things that happen after. So every time he calls a c-bet, we would play differently on every turn. Full minimally exploitative play would also alter the things that happen beforehand. It would alter our c-betting range to compensate for the fact that our opponent's going to call too much. So, presumably we bluff less and value bet more. And obviously, full minimally exploited play is always going to win more against a leak than downstream minimally exploited play. In games like poker, I think it's always better to use the full minimally exploitative strategy. In some games where, you have more complete information, it might make sense to wait until you actually see your opponent make a mistake before you start to minimally exploit it. I don't think that applies to poker. So, maximally exploited play versus minimally exploited play. Why is minimally exploited play better? First, maximally exploited play is extremely counter-exploitable. Minimally exploited play is much less so. So again, if we think about rock, paper, scissors as an example, let's imagine that we're playing a player who does have a leak. We know he plays rock 34%, and he plays scissors and paper each 33%. If we were to play maximally exploited play against this player, it would be to always play paper. And each round, we'd win 34%, we'd tie 32%, or 33%, and we'd lose 33%. And so each round, on average, we'd win, say the pot was $100, we'd win $1 per round. So let's say we're playing 50 rounds against this guy. And in the first 49 rounds, he sticks to his strategy. And in EV, we've worked up ourselves to plus $49. And remember, what he's seeing us do is play paper over and over and over and over. So he's seen 49 papers in a row. And say after 49 papers in a row, he finally says, okay, this guy is clearly exploiting me. In this last round, I'm going to counter-exploit him, and I'm just going to play scissors. In that round, he'll gain back $100 of EV from the $100 pot. And so over the course of those 50 rounds, we'll end up losing $51 in EV. We'll win 49 and then lose 100. Even though our opponent has a leak that we understand and know exactly how to beat. Maximally exploited play is often like this. It's going to be so counter-exploitable that especially if our opponent's leak isn't massive, if it's like he calls c-bets a little too much or he folds the c-bets a little too much, even if it takes your opponent a very long time to catch on, catching on just once will counter you so much harder than you are exploiting them that you can be, completely abused. So if we take, maybe a more real-world poker example, say you feel like there's this guy who folds to overbets a little too much on the river. Maximally exploited play is to never value bet and overbet at him and always bluff because he folds a little too much. If you're doing that over and over, you might be picking up small bits of EV with your bluffs because, say, instead of calling the 40% he calls 35. But if he ever catches on that you're not value betting, say he calls you 10 times and sees that you've never held it, you could easily lose more from the one time he calls you later than the first 10 times that you made him fold. 2, maximally exploited play requires complete knowledge of our opponent's strategy to calculate. Minimally exploited play does not. So just kind of by definition, maximally exploited play is take my opponent's complete fixed strategy and do the highest EV thing against that at every possible decision point. You can't actually have a computer calculate that unless you know the complete strategy. So in a full game tree sense, this means you'd have to know how your opponent plays against c-bets to start with, but also how they play on every possible turn card, every possible river card, how they would react when they raise and you re-raise them on the flop. Every possible part of the game tree, you need to know how they play to compute maximally exploited play accurately. And so there's programs that will kind of do this like Cardinals EV, but that doesn't let you have them play differently on every turn and river card that come. So in terms of actually analyzing a full strategy across multiple streets, Cardinal DV's maximally exploit button is basically useless. It doesn't tell you anything. And the only way to actually compute maximally exploitative play is to put in a full strategy for your opponent. And that's not really ever going to be practical because a full strategy is bigger. It would take you days to even describe it. You could never possibly observe your opponent enough to know what their full strategy is. It's completely incalculable. Whereas minimally exploited play only requires that you study some very specific part of their game and understand some very specific leak that they have. And then once you've done that, you can calculate a minimally exploited strategy just based on that knowledge and know that if you play that minimally exploited strategy and you're correct about their leak and they don't adjust that specific leak, they can do whatever they want everywhere else in the game tree. And your EV is locked in because you've identified one specific leak and are exploiting it. And that leads into the last point, which is maximally exploited play is untargeted. It's not attacking a specific leak. It's attacking the whole strategy at once. And you need to know that whole strategy to attack it. Whereas minimally exploited play targets a specific leak, and this also lets us measure the magnitude of the leak. So again, if we go back to that rock, paper, scissors, brain teaser example, if the leak is just that he plays rock half the time, but we don't actually know the rest of his strategy, minimally exploited play can be computed just knowing only that he has to play rock half the time, that he might do other stuff. And we can say exactly how big a leak it is to play rock half the time. It turns out it's a sixth of the pot. And maximally exploited play, we can't even compute it if all we know is that he plays rock half the time. And it can't really be used for EV measurement of that specific leak because you can't compute it. And then the EV you get when you play it depends on what he does the rest of the time. So in my opinion, minimally exploited play is just a way, way more powerful idea than maximally exploited play, and is really something that you can kind of, all the steps that are required to take theory to practice are there. You can look in your Hem or PT database and say, okay, this guy's been calling my C-bets 50%. You can look at a bunch, or folding to my C-bets 40%, say. You can look at a bunch of the hands where he did call you and kind of get a sense of what his calling range is, or use population ranges to estimate, or use common sense, whatever. You can then throw just that specific leak into a strategy calculator. The one we're going to use here is called Simple Postflop. And then you can get a strategy out of that you can play that will actually measure the leak. You can look at the EV difference when the leak is enforced and when it's not, and say, oh, that EV gain for me is exactly due to this leak. It's exactly due to me minimally exploiting him, and I know exactly how big a mistake a player with this leak is making and how to target it. So hopefully that gets you guys excited about computing minimally exploited play. Let's look at how we actually do this. What we're going to do is we're going to look at one of these solutions from my flop Seedbed defense video pack, which is in the GTO dojo. And I'm going to make this solution publicly browsable. I'll put a link in the blog post that I embed this video in. There'll also be a link to it in the comments directly below on YouTube. So you guys can go check it out, browse this solution. But the basic scenario is very simple. It's a single raised pot, cutoff versus big blind, and the board came king 8-6. And so here the villain is the big blind player. They mostly check. And then the hero c-bets, and the villain folds 50%. And the tool I'm going to use to actually do these minimally exploitive calcs, GTO Rangebuilder doesn't do this yet, is called Simple Postflop. And I have a tutorial video for how to use this software. It's a new piece of software that just came out. The creators are Russian, so they don't speak fluent English, so I've been helping them with a tutorial video on how to use it, helping people understand why it's good. It's very new, so that it's a little rough around the edges on the interface, but it's very powerful, has a fast engine. Its results for solutions, I've checked them against Gtorb. They're accurate to the best of my knowledge, and I've done a fair amount of testing, so you guys can trust it. They have a free version that will let you check out turn and river calculations, and then you can also go and buy the flop solving version. They have two versions of it, a cloud solver that will solve it on their servers, and a desktop version that will solve it on your own computer. And I will put a link to download this software in the comments to reward me for making these tutorial videos. I am an affiliate, so please click my affiliate link below if you found this video helpful and want to buy the software. So how does this work? First, this is just the base scenario. I just mimicked exactly what we had gtorb solve here. As we can see, the EVs for player 2, which is the hero, for gtorb, is 33.74 according to gtorb, 3.372 according to simple postflop. They express everything in terms of big blinds, whereas this was based on a NL1K hand. So you can just divide everything by 10. So they're within 0.002 big blinds of each other, which is within the Nash distance of gtorb, and they have almost exactly the same Nash distance here as well, because again the Nash distance is scaled by a factor of 10. So basically exactly the same solution. Remember that the definition of GTO requires that if two programs have a GTO solution and the difference between the EVs they report is greater than the sum of the two programs' Nash distances, then one of the programs is wrong. That's guaranteed. It does not necessarily require that every action frequency is the same. There's going to be cases where where there's multiple equilibrium, where it actually doesn't matter exactly what you do in some situation. It's still GTO either way. So you may see slight differences in frequencies. The other thing I want to mention is there is currently a difference in how simple postflop reports aggregate frequencies and how gtorb report them. So with this, say we look at the hero bets here and the villain calls. Gtorb's going to show you 43.1%. Simple postflop's going to show you 43.66%. Those are slightly different, and the reason for that is that gtorb shows you percentages that are based on simulating the two strategies playing each other with the starting ranges. So the blocker effects of that the villain holds a slightly different range conditional on the hero betting, because some of the hero betting range blocks some of the villain calling range, are accounted for in gtorb's presentation of the aggregate call frequency. The simple postflop approach rather just says what percentage of their range they call with, and doesn't account for that their range may be blocked by the hero's betting range. So you'll see slightly different presentation here, but if you actually drill into the strategy here and see, how does player 1 respond, if we look at something like pocket eights where it's mixing, we can click on it and see they have us calling 30% with those two combos. And if we go here in gtorb and again look at pocket eights, we will see 31%. I think that's just rounding. So the frequencies should be very close to an exact match. You might get a percent or two of variation that would be within the EV difference of the Nash distance, even though the aggregate frequencies might not always match. It's just because gtorb and simple postflop present the same data a different way. It's whether you include blockers in your aggregate frequencies or not. The aggregate frequencies are not really actually part of the strategy. They're kind of implied by the strategy. The true strategy is what to do with every hand. So we have these two scenarios that, are identical scenario in both programs from my flop Seedbed defense video pack. And what we're going to do here is look at measuring the leak and examining what minimally exploited play looks like when you impose the restriction that player 1 has to fold according to 1 minus alpha, which would be only folding 40% to this 2/3 pot c-bet, rather than GTO is to fold close to 50%. So how do you actually do that in simple postflop? What you can do is you can right-click on a strategy, and you can go to Edit Strategy, and then you can get in here and force a player to fold a specific hand. So if I want to say this player is forced to fold pocket sevens, that's the leak I'm going to minimally exploit. I can just use their GUI and force specific actions. And then when I click Apply here, we'll see that my fold percentage changed. I added another hand that was required to fold. My fold percentage went up. But to actually get value out of this, I then need to rerun the scenarios. I need to recalculate the flop. And the flop calculations take a little while, 30 minutes or so. This scenario is a little simpler, might be a little quicker. So I'm not going to run any here. I've already pre-computed them, and I'm going to show you exactly what I got. So the first thing I did was I went in and I tried to lock in a c-bet defense that would involve folding only 40%. And it turns out that this is a big enough mistake that GTO play really tries to circumvent it. So I'd gone into the strategy, I'd edited it, and it had looked like what I was doing was going to force them to fold only 40%. But they took some of the hands that they were previously, what GTO play ends up doing to avoid this poor c-bet defense strategy, is it takes some of the hands that it was GTO to fold before, and instead switches to leading with them. So it actually tries to start donking to avoid being forced to play so poorly against c-bets. So then what I had to do, just like in gtorb, you can edit the game tree. For a simple post-flop, you can edit the game tree on the starting street. You can't edit the turn or river trees, but you can edit the flop tree. So I went in and I deleted this this betting node to actually force we don't shift our range to donking to avoid this locked node. Because again, for minimally sway to play, we let the player do anything they want outside of the node we're locking. So we're locking in this response to c-bet defense. You can see there's a little locked icon next to all these nodes. But we're letting the player play as they like according on the rest of the game tree. And it turns out if you force this player to play so poorly against c-bets, they'll try and compensate by donking. So instead what I did is I went ahead and removed the ability for the player to donk, and then put in this 40% fold strategy. And this is now a more accurate representation where they're forced to fold exactly this much, and we can do our leak measurement. And the way we do that is we just look at the base EVs. So before, the base EV for player 2, who is the hero, he's the guy who's c-betting, was 3.372. Now it's 3.418. So there's a gain of about 0.045 chips, and that's per hand. So if we want to do that in BBs per 100, it would be about 4.5 BBs per 100 is the minimally exploitative magnitude of the leak. And so that gives us a concrete answer to how bad is it to defend 1 minus alpha as opposed to GTO in a spot like this. The answer is that every time you get into the situation, so it's not going to affect your win rate exactly at that many BBs per 100 because a lot of hands you just fold pre-flop or something. But every time you get into the situation, you're going to lose 4.5 BBs per 100. So if you went into your HEM database, say, and filtered for, when you call a cutoff open from the big blind, you would look at your win rate there and just, subtract 4.5 BBs per 100 if you were going to try and play a 1 minus alpha defense. So that is a concrete mathematical definition of the magnitude of the leak. Now you may wonder exactly what hands I forced you to, what hands I locked into the strategy of forcing you to call instead of fold. If you watch my flop c-bet defense pack, I went through the original GTO strategy and picked all the hands that were the closest to being higher EV to call than to fold, and added just enough hands to end up at a 40% call. So I attempted to really pick the best possible 1 minus alpha range. I can't guarantee that I did that correctly because you can't guarantee that you picked the right range when the range you're picking is not GTO, if that makes sense. You can't. It's possible there's a slightly better 1 minus alpha range. Most players are probably using a worse one who are playing this way. But this is a very good way to, it's an exact measurement of the exact magnitude of the leak of defending this 1 minus alpha range, and I would guess that is very close to the absolute best 1 minus alpha range you could create. So that is powerful. We now know exactly numerically it is a 4.5 BB per 100 leak, conditional on defending your big blind against a cutoff open, to play this 1 minus alpha defense on this type of board. But we also know more than that, our goal is not just going to be, say, like, don't defend 1 minus alpha. An interesting question is, how do you exploit someone who is defending more? And one of the pieces of feedback I got from my flop Seedbed defense pack was a player who noted that some of the bigger winners in his mid-stakes games were, in fact, defending close to 1 minus alpha. And he guessed that they were doing so exploitatively because they knew that a lot of the players they were playing against were not c-betting very well. They were c-betting too wide. A notable element of GTO play on this situation is that you actually only c-bet about 40%, and a lot of players c-bet more than that, and that they were exploiting their opponents by calling c-bets more widely as well. And so his question was, how do I actually attack an opponent who seems to be a strong player? These are some of the strongest players in the games who are defending against c-bets, what seems like too much, but maybe in an exploitative way. And these are the strongest players in his games. He doesn't necessarily think he can outplay them. But with minimally exploited play, you don't need to. The whole idea of minimally exploited play is that if they actually defend c-bets like this, whether they think it's because they're going to be able to outplay you on the turn or whether they think it's because your c-betting range is wrong, if you play according to the minimally exploitative strategy, as long as they continue to defend c-bets this way, you're guaranteed to win this extra EV from them. Those 4.5 BBs per 100 are yours. There's nothing they can do to stop it, short of adjusting directly their c-bet defense. So to think about that, I briefly want to look at the way the strategy shifts and what the minimally exploited strategy actually looks like compared to the GTO strategy. And again, this is going to demonstrate how powerful minimally exploited play is, because the shift is going to be reasonably small, reasonably sensible, and difficult to identify and counter-exploit. A maximally exploited shift like this might be to never c-bet. I don't know exactly what it is, because we can't compute it without knowing a full strategy. But usually maximally exploitive strategies are going to be kind of all or nothing. I don't think it would be to never c-bet, but it would be a big shift. Whereas here what we see is that instead of c-betting 39.2%, we're c-betting 35.5%. So it's a little less, which makes sense because they're folding a little less. So we want to bluff a little less. And if we actually pull up the range of c-betting and compare them, we can kind of see that the spots where we're actually decreasing are generally going to be with hands that have a decent checkback EV. So like, a decrease might come with 10-7. GTorb has us betting it in aggregate about 36% of the time because it has a gut shot, and with some fold equity, it's worth betting. Here, in aggregate, if we add these up and divide by 4, we're betting more like 20% of the time because the point of indifference shifts a bit when we're not getting folds as often. It becomes a little better to check back and try and hit our draw. And, I'll put the GTO strategy online. You guys can play around with simple post-flop yourselves. But if you actually kind of look at the strategy, see what's shifting, it's mostly going to be shifts towards taking a few more free cards with hands that either have draws or could improve to draws, as well as value betting a little more thinly. With a hand like King 10, we're going to be betting a little more against an opponent who calls too lightly than we would against an opponent who calls correctly. So that is minimally exploited play, how to calculate it. Some of its uses, it's got a lot more uses that I'll get into in my next video strategy pack, where I'm going to be looking at blind versus blind play. In 6max, blind versus blind play is a situation where the way people tend to play in practice is actually drastically different from what GTO play looks like. And so we'll be able to look at questions of why do you see people c-bet so much more than GTO says? How do we minimally exploit that? If they are c-betting so much, maybe because their opponents fold to c-bet so much, are they kind of following a minimally exploitive line against a high fold to c-bet? How are people in today's games kind of exploiting and counter-exploiting each other? Why might they be doing that? And how when we are the Seedbed defender, can we exploit people who Seedbed too much, and how, when we are the Seedbedder, can we exploit people who fold to Seedbeds too much. So I'm going to be leveraging this minimally exploitative concept in a fair number of ways over the coming months because I think it's so important and so powerful. The goal of this video is to introduce the concept to you guys, show you how you can calculate it, and hopefully you guys can go and use it in your own ways, and maybe post in the comments if you have ideas of or questions about how it could be used. I'll definitely incorporate feedback I get on this video into my next strategy pack on blind versus blind. So that is the end. Please comment and ask questions on this video if anything was unclear. You can either post questions in the comments on my blog post, or you can post in the YouTube comments. I always answer. As always, check out my blog at blog.gtorangebuilder.com. Subscribe. I'm always putting out cool stuff. The GTO Dojo / the Seedbed Defense Strategy Pack that I reference in this video is available at gtorangebuilder.com/GTO Dojo. In addition to the King 8-6 board that I will make publicly accessible in a link below, there's going to be a whole bunch of other boards in hour and a half plus video analysis of why these boards play like they do, how you can learn from them, etc. So definitely check that out. Always follow me on Twitter, GTO Range Builder. I always tweet when I release new stuff, so it's a good way to keep up to date with what I'm up to. Same on the YouTube channel. And then for simple Postflop, I will put my tutorial video on how to use the software so you guys can set up this kind of stuff on your own, as well as my affiliate link to download it in the comments below. So definitely check that out. Their software is really good. It is a little rough around the edges, and they definitely need feedback on the UI. So if you check it out, they're extremely helpful, extremely responsive. You can either let me know or let them know, and we will work to make the software better together. So thanks for watching, guys.